The October wind cut through the gaps in the cabin walls like a blade, carrying with it the scent of snow that hadn't yet fallen but promised to arrive soon. Margaret Hartwell pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the single window watching the grey clouds gather over the Montana mountains. The glass was cracked from last winter's freeze, and she'd patched it with cloth, but the cold still seeped through. Behind her, the fireplace held nothing but cold ashes and the memory of warmth. She counted the remaining pieces of wood stacked against the far wall. 7 logs, maybe 8 if she split the largest one. Not enough. Not nearly enough for a Montana winter that could stretch 5 months or more. Her husband Thomas had always prepared for winter by August, cutting and splitting cord after cord of pine and oak. But Thomas had been in the ground since spring, taken by a fever that came sudden and merciless. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cold window. At 42 she felt ancient, worn down by grief and the endless struggle of managing the homestead alone. Her nearest neighbours, the Prescotts, lived 12 miles away, a day's hard ride even in good weather. The town of Cedar Falls was even farther, and she had no horse anyway. Thomas's mare had wandered off during a storm in July, and Margaret had never found her. The first snowflake drifted past the window, followed by another, then another. Margaret's breath fogged the glass as panic rose in her chest. She wasn't ready. She would never be ready. A sharp knock at the door froze her blood. Out here, visitors were rare, and rarely brought good news. Margaret's hand went instinctively to Thomas's rifle, hanging above the mantel. But she'd used the last of the ammunition hunting rabbits weeks ago. She approached the door slowly, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Silence. Margaret peered through the gap between the door and frame. A man stood on her porch, tall and lean, wearing buckskins darkened with age and weather. His black hair was braided and hung past his shoulders. In his right hand he held a well-worn axe, its blade glinting despite the grey light. Apache. She was certain of it, though she'd only seen a few in her 3 years in Montana territory. Most settlers spoke of them with fear, but Thomas had always said fear came from not understanding. Still, her heart hammered as she lifted the latch. The door opened with a groan of old hinges. The man stood perfectly still, his dark eyes taking in her face, her worn dress, the empty woodpile behind her. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35, with weathered skin and a scar that curved from his left temple to his jaw. His gaze moved past her to the cold fireplace, and something shifted in his expression. They stared at each other for a long moment, snow falling between them. He didn't speak, and neither did she. But then he nodded toward her empty woodpile and lifted the axe slightly, the question clear without words. Margaret's throat felt dry as sand. Every story she'd heard about Apache raids flickered through her mind, but looking at this man, she saw no violence in his stance, no threat in his eyes. Only something that might have been recognition, the look of someone who understood what it meant to face winter unprepared. She began, then stopped. What was she supposed to say? That she was alone, that she was afraid, that she'd been preparing to die when the snows came? The man waited, snow gathering on his shoulders like a dusting of flour. His patience was complete, as if he had all the time in the world to stand there while she decided whether to trust him or bar the door forever. Finally, Margaret stepped aside. He moved past her into the cabin, bringing with him the scent of pine smoke and something wild she couldn't name. He surveyed the room with the same careful attention he'd given her, the empty fireplace, the meager furniture Thomas had built, the corners where cold air pooled. His gaze lingered on the wedding photograph on the mantel, Thomas in his best suit and Margaret in her mother's white dress, both of them young and full of hope. When he looked back at her, his eyes held a knowledge that made her chest tighten. He'd seen the fresh grave behind the cabin. He knew she was alone. Without a word, he walked to the back door and stepped outside. Margaret followed, wrapping her arms around herself as the snow fell harder now, already dusting the ground white. He stood beside Thomas's grave for a moment, then walked to the edge of the property where the forest began. He raised the axe and brought it down on a dead pine, the sound sharp and clean in the quiet air. The tree shuddered, groaned, and fell with a crash that echoed off the mountains. Margaret watched from the doorway as he began to work, his movements efficient and rhythmic. He stripped the branches, cut the trunk into manageable pieces, and carried them to her woodpile. Then he returned to the forest for another tree. By evening, when the snow was falling thick and fast, he had cut enough wood to last a month. Margaret had tried to speak to him several times, to ask his name, to offer him food, to understand why he was helping her. But he worked in silence, acknowledging her words only with slight nods. As darkness fell, he stacked the last of the wood and built a fire in her fireplace. The flames caught quickly, filling the cabin with blessed warmth. Margaret stood close to the fire, feeling the heat penetrate her bones for the first time in weeks. When she turned to thank him, he was gone. She ran to the front door and looked out into the swirling snow, but saw nothing except the dark shapes of trees and the faint impression of footprints already being covered by fresh snow. On the porch, leaning against her doorframe, was the axe. The axe became Margaret's lifeline. Every morning for the next 2 weeks, she found fresh wood stacked beside her door, not a huge amount, but enough to keep the fire burning through the day and night. She never saw him cut it. She never heard him approach, but every dawn brought the gift of warmth. She began leaving things for him in return. A plate of cornbread on the porch rail, a cup of coffee still hot when she set it out before sunrise, small tokens that disappeared while she slept, though she was never sure if he took them or if the wind and animals claimed them. The snows came heavier now, transforming the world into a hushed wilderness of white. Margaret's cabin felt like a ship in an endless sea, isolated but secure. She fell into a routine. Rise before dawn, tend the fire he'd fed through the night with wood she hadn't cut, prepare simple meals from her dwindling supplies, and watch the forest through her cracked window. Sometimes she thought she saw movement in the trees, a shadow that might have been a man, a flash of buckskin against the snow. But when she looked directly, there was nothing. On the 15th morning, the wood didn't come. Margaret woke to a cold cabin and the sound of wind howling around the eaves. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and checked the porch, but found nothing except snow drifted against the door. The axe still leaned where he'd left it, but her anonymous guardian was nowhere to be seen. She spent the morning burning the last of her reserve wood, trying not to panic. By afternoon, with no sign of him, she pulled on Thomas's old coat and boots and ventured out with the axe. The snow was knee-deep and still falling. Margaret had cut wood before, but never in weather like this, never with the desperation that clawed at her chest. She found a fallen branch near the tree line and began to chop, but the wet wood was stubborn, and her inexperienced hands raised blisters within minutes. She was struggling with a particularly thick branch when she heard the crack of breaking wood behind her. Margaret spun around, nearly losing her balance in the snow, and saw him emerge from the forest like a ghost made flesh. He looked different, paler, moving with less fluidity than before. As he came closer, she saw the dark stain on his left shoulder, the way he favored that side. "You're hurt," she said, the first words either of them had spoken aloud. He glanced at his shoulder, then at the pathetic pile of wood she'd managed to cut. Without answering, he took the axe from her hands and began to work, though she could see the pain in the tight lines around his eyes. "Stop," Margaret said. "You're making it worse." He paused, the axe halfway raised, and looked at her with surprise. It was the first time she'd given him a direct command, the first time she'd asserted any authority in their strange partnership. "Come inside," she said. "Let me look at that wound." For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then he set down the axe and followed her to the cabin. Inside, by the firelight, the extent of his injury became clear. The wound was a deep gash across his shoulder blade, partially healed but infected. Margaret had tended enough injuries on the farm to recognize the angry red edges, the heat radiating from the torn flesh. "What happened?" she asked, fetching her small supply of medical materials. He sat on the stool by the fire, his back straight despite the pain. "Bear," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "3 days ago." It was the first word she'd heard him speak, and his accent carried the careful precision of someone speaking a second language. Margaret mixed a poultice from the herbs she'd dried that summer, plantain and yarrow, comfrey and wild garlic. The supplies were meant to last her through winter, but what use were they if they both froze to death? "This will hurt," she warned, approaching with the medicine. He nodded once, then sat still as stone while she cleaned the wound and applied the poultice. His skin was fever-hot under her hands, and she could feel the tension in his muscles as he fought not to flinch. When she bandaged the shoulder with strips torn from one of her few remaining clean shirts, he finally relaxed slightly. "What's your name?" Margaret asked. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Joseph." "Joseph?" She couldn't hide her surprise. It seemed too ordinary a name for someone who moved like a shadow and appeared with firewood like a guardian spirit. "The missionaries gave it to me," he said. "My real name." He said something in Apache, a fluid sound like water over stones. "It means watches from far places." "Adi," Margaret sat back on her heels, studying his face in the firelight. "I'm Margaret Hartwell." "I know," he said simply. "How do you know?" "Your husband's grave. The name on the stone." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind outside and the snap of burning wood, the intimacy of the moment. This stranger sitting shirtless in her cabin while she tended his wounds should have felt wrong, improper. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked finally. Joseph stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "In my childhood, winter came early. My mother—" He paused, searching for words. "She was alone, like you. No husband, no family close by. The cold took her." Margaret's chest tightened. "I'm sorry. I was 7 winters. Old enough to cut wood, not old enough to cut enough." He touched the bandage on his shoulder gingerly. "I remember the cold. I remember hunger. I remember watching her grow weaker each day, knowing I could not save her." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with old grief. Margaret understood now, the patient way he'd approached her cabin, the careful distance he'd maintained, the gifts left without expectation of thanks or recognition. He wasn't trying to save her exactly. He was trying to save the boy he'd been, the mother he'd lost. "You've saved me," Margaret said quietly. "You know that, don't you?" Joseph looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. In his dark eyes, she saw not just the man who'd been cutting her firewood, but someone who carried his own deep loneliness, his own scars that went far deeper than the bear's claws. "Winter is long," he said, "not saved yet." Margaret smiled, the first real smile she'd felt since Thomas died. "Then I guess you'd better stay until it's over." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, wariness, and beneath it all, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Stay? The wound needs tending, and I—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "I could use the company." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret held her breath, suddenly afraid he would refuse, would disappear back into the forest and leave her alone again. "I will stay," he said finally, "until spring." Joseph made his bed on the floor by the fireplace, using blankets Margaret had stored in Thomas's chest. She offered him the bed, but he refused with a shake of his head, and she didn't press the issue. Some boundaries, she was learning, were meant to be respected rather than crossed. The days fell into a new rhythm. Joseph's shoulder healed slowly, forcing him to rest more than his nature seemed to allow. Margaret took over more of the wood-cutting, her hands growing calloused and strong. He taught her to read the forest, which trees would burn cleanest, how to split wood with the grain instead of fighting it, where to find the dry deadfall even under snow. They spoke in fragments at first, their conversations like stepping stones across a river of silence. Joseph's English was better than he'd initially let on, but he seemed to weigh each word carefully before speaking, as if language itself was a tool that could cut or heal, depending on how it was used. "Your husband," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, Margaret mending her dress while he carved something from a piece of pine. "He was good to you." It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "Yes, very good." She looked at the photograph on the mantel, Thomas's serious face gazing back at her. "We met in Illinois. He was working his father's farm, saving money to go west. I was supposed to marry someone else." Joseph's hands stilled on his carving. "Supposed to?" "An arrangement. My father's idea." Margaret set down her needle, remembering. Charles Whitmore, good family, good prospects, everything a father wants for his daughter except... She trailed off. "Except love," Joseph finished. "Except choice." Margaret smiled ruefully. "Thomas gave me choice. He asked me to marry him, but he also told me if I said no, he'd help me get to California where my cousin lived. No strings, no conditions. Just because he thought everyone deserved to choose their own path. And you chose him." "I chose him." Margaret picked up her sewing again, but her hands moved slowly, lost in memory. "My father disowned me. Said I was throwing my life away on a dreamer who'd never amount to anything. Maybe he was right about the amounting to something part. We never got rich, never had the big family we planned. But Thomas made me laugh every single day for 15 years. That has to count for something." Joseph resumed his carving, the soft scraping sound rhythmic and soothing. "My wife laughed," he said quietly. Margaret's hands stilled. In all their conversations, he'd never mentioned a wife. "She died in the winter sickness. 6 years past. Her name was..." He said something in Apache, then translated, "Morning light." He held up his carving, a small bird, wings spread as if caught in flight. "She loved birds, said they carried messages between the earth and sky." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and meant it. "She would have liked you," Joseph said, which surprised Margaret with its certainty. She believed kindness was the only thing that mattered. Rich, poor, Apache, white. She said people were just people, trying to get through each day without too much pain. Margaret set down her mending and really looked at him. "Is that why you helped me? Because she would have wanted you to?" Joseph considered this, turning the wooden bird over in his hands. "Maybe at first, but now..." He met her eyes across the fire. "Now I help you because you make good coffee, and you don't ask too many questions, and when you smile, you look like someone who remembers what hope feels like." The words hung between them, intimate and careful. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "Joseph," she began, then stopped. What was she going to say? That she looked forward to his presence more than she should? That the cabin felt empty when he went out to hunt or check his snares? That she'd started wearing her one good dress instead of her work clothes, just in case he noticed? "I know," he said softly. I feel it too. They stared at each other across the small space of the cabin, and Margaret felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition, a possibility, a door opening where before there had been only walls. "It's too soon," she said, thinking of Thomas's grave, of what the neighbors would say if they knew she was harboring an Apache man through the winter, let alone developing feelings for him. "Yes," Joseph agreed. "Too soon, too complicated, too many reasons why it cannot be." "But," Margaret said, the word slipping out before she could stop it. "But," Joseph echoed and smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his entire face, erasing years of hardship and revealing the man he might have been in a different world, under different circumstances. Margaret smiled back, and for a moment the cabin felt full of more than just warmth from the fire. It felt full of possibility. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, but inside, two people who had thought they were done with such things began to discover that the heart, like the forest, had seasons of its own, and sometimes, even in the deepest winter, new growth could begin. That night, Margaret lay in bed listening to Joseph's quiet breathing from the floor below. She thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared and the promises they'd made. She thought about the strange turns life could take, how loss could crack you open in ways that let in not just pain, but light. She didn't know what would happen when spring came, when the snows melted and the world opened up again. She didn't know if what was growing between them could survive outside the protected space of the cabin, away from the necessity that had brought them together. But for now, for tonight, it was enough to know she wasn't alone. It was enough to have someone to tend and someone to tend her. It was enough to remember that the heart, like the body, was made to endure, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, to love again. March arrived with a false warmth that fooled the earliest wildflowers into blooming, only to bury them under a late blizzard that lasted 3 days. Margaret and Joseph weathered it together, playing cards by firelight and sharing stories that went deeper than the careful offerings of earlier months. Joseph told her about his childhood in the Chiricahua Mountains, about learning to hunt with his grandfather and the year they followed the deer migration north. Margaret spoke of her sister who died of scarlet fever, of the doll she'd kept until she was 16, of the way Thomas used to sing off-key while he worked in the garden. They were weaving themselves together, story by story, creating something that was neither his life nor hers, but something entirely new. When the storm cleared, they woke to a world transformed. The snow was melting in earnest now, creating streams where none had existed before. The air smelled of earth and growing things, and Margaret could hear birds she hadn't noticed all winter. "Soon," Joseph said, standing by the window with his coffee, watching the water run off the roof in silver streams. Margaret didn't ask what he meant. She knew. Soon the passes would clear. Soon travel would be possible again. Soon the world would intrude on the small universe they'd created in the cabin. She'd been dreading this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, she felt surprisingly calm. They'd known from the beginning that this was temporary, a season outside of regular life, a gift stolen from circumstances that should have been nothing but hardship. "The Prescotts will come to check on me," Margaret said. "Probably within the week." Joseph nodded. He'd known this too. Good neighbors always checked on widows after hard winters. "They'll be surprised to find me alive," Margaret continued, managing a smile. "I don't think they expected me to make it through." "You're stronger than they know," Joseph said. "Stronger than you knew." It was true. Margaret looked back at the woman she'd been in October, frightened, despairing, ready to give up, and barely recognized her. That woman had never cut firewood, or treated an infected wound, or learned to read weather in the clouds. That woman had never sat up all night with a fever-sick man or felt her heart crack open with unexpected love. "What will you do?" she asked. "When you leave?" Joseph was quiet for a long time. "I have a cousin in Arizona Territory. I haven't seen him in many years, but—" He shrugged. "It's somewhere to start. Arizona is a long way." "Yes." Margaret turned from the window to face him fully. "There's another choice." Joseph set down his coffee cup very carefully. "Margaret, hear me out." Margaret took a breath, gathering courage. "The homestead is 40 acres. Good water, decent soil. I can't work it alone, but with help—" She paused. "I know what people would say. I know the complications, but I also know that I'm happier with you here than I've been since Thomas died. I know that you understand hard work and taking care of things. I know that what we have, it's real." Joseph stared at her, and Margaret could see the war in his expression, hope and fear and longing all mixed together. "You don't know what you're asking," he said finally. "A white woman and an Apache man living together, the hatred that would bring down on both of us?" "I know it wouldn't be easy," Margaret admitted, "but nothing worthwhile ever is. And besides," she smiled, "I've never been one to do what people expected of me. Ask my father." Joseph laughed despite himself, then grew serious again. "Your neighbors, the Prescotts, are good people. They'll be shocked at first, but they're practical above all else. If you help me make the farm profitable, if we conduct ourselves with dignity, they'll come around. As for the others," Margaret shrugged, "I've been alone before. I can be alone again if I have to. But I'd rather be alone with you than alone by myself." Joseph crossed the room to stand in front of her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "Are you certain? Once this choice is made, it cannot be unmade easily." Margaret thought of Thomas, of the photograph on the mantel, of the life she'd built and lost and was now being offered a chance to build again, differently, but no less real. "I'm certain," she said. Joseph reached out and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Then I will stay. Not just for the season, for as long as you'll have me." Margaret leaned into his touch, feeling something inside her chest unfurl like a flower finally allowed to bloom. "That might be a very long time." "I hope so," Joseph said, and kissed her, soft and careful at first, then with growing certainty as she kissed him back. When they broke apart, Margaret rested her forehead against his. Outside, she could hear the steady drip of snow melting from the eaves, the sound of winter finally releasing its hold. "We should go to town soon," Margaret said practically. "File the papers to add your name to the homestead claim. Get ahead of the gossip." "Papers," Joseph said with amusement. "The government will want to know if I'm civilized enough to own land." "You cut firewood for a stranger all winter," Margaret pointed out. "If that's not civilized, I don't know what is." 3 days later, they hitched up the cart Margaret had thought she'd never use again and drove to Cedar Falls together. The town clerk was scandalized, the preacher disapproving, and half the women in the general store whispered behind their hands. But the papers were filed, the land claimed jointly, and their intention to marry announced publicly. Margaret Hartwell, who had once run away from an arranged marriage to choose her own path, was choosing again. This time she was choosing hope over fear, love over loneliness, and a future that looked nothing like what she'd planned, but everything like what she wanted. As they drove home in the spring sunshine, Joseph reached over and took her hand. Their fingers interlaced naturally, work-roughened palms fitting together like pieces of a puzzle finally solved. Behind them, the town of Cedar Falls buzzed with scandal and speculation. Ahead of them, the mountains stretched toward horizons they would explore together, and in between 40 acres of good land waited to be planted, tended, and turned into whatever they had the courage to grow. Margaret squeezed Joseph's hand and smiled. She had firewood enough for next winter, and the winter after that, and all the winters to come. More than that, she had someone to share the warmth. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was everything.